Chapter 96. The Conditional Covenant. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 16 to 19. This day the Lord thy God hath commanded thee to do these statutes and judgments. Thou shalt therefore keep and do them with all thine heart, and with all thy soul. Thou hast avouched the Lord this day to be thy God, and to walk in his ways, and to keep his statutes, and his commandments, and his judgments, and to hearken unto his voice. And the Lord hath avouched thee this day to be his peculiar people, as he hath promised thee, and that thou shouldest keep all his commandments, and to make thee high above all nations which he hath made in praise, and in name, and in honour, and that thou mayest be an holy people unto the Lord thy God, as he hath spoken. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 16 to 19. Some commentators have little to say about these verses, seen as simply a conclusion to the statement of the law. But Phillips is perceptive in calling attention to a central fact. The blessing remains conditional on Israel's obedience. Israel's sin was to assume that the blessings were unconditional and an inheritance and property, a transgression commonplace in various churches as well. More than a few nations and families highly blessed have also assumed that God's blessing is a permanent property. These verses presuppose the covenant. God, in his grace and mercy, gives to Israel his covenant and law. The law is a gift of grace. The happy side of the law is that obedience leads to blessings, whereas disobedience leads to curses. The sin of men and nations has been to treat God's providential blessings as natural prerogatives. To do so is to invite judgment. There is a repeated emphasis on the obligation to walk in his ways, and to keep his statutes, and his commandments, and his judgments, and to hearken unto his voice. Thou shouldest keep all his commandments, verses 17 and 18. This must be done with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, verse 16. We do not have here a demand for total obedience on pain of judgment, but rather that our total direction be one of faithfulness to our covenant God. God does not give his covenant law to the people as a device for punishing them, but as a way of life and of blessing. This is made very clear in Deuteronomy chapter 28. This is why we are called upon to reverence the covenant law, to use David F. Payne's term. We do not revere the laws of the states, at best we obey them. The one is God's law, expressing his nature, whereas the other is often no more than the arbitrary will of the state. The promise to covenant obedience is that the people will be exalted by God. In verse 19, we are told that God promises to the covenantally faithful people to make thee high above all nations which he hath made. This is a remarkable promise, and a key to history. These words form the conclusion to the covenant or treaty. This is ancient legal language. God is the suzerain, and Israel is the vassal. The generation that left Egypt was faithless to the covenant law and perished in the wilderness. The younger generation now had the privilege of covenantal life. Leslie J. Hoppe says of verse 19, "A national life lived in accord with the divine law cannot help but reflect divine glory." Covenantal obligations are opportunities for the fullness of life and blessing. To view the law negatively, as antinomians do, is to view life unfavourably or with hostility. For law is to life what our bones are to our ability to function. Deuteronomy 28 makes it clear that the choice is between life and death. Many other texts, such as Psalm 1, restate this same fact. The covenant makes it very clear that grace and law are inseparable. Any faith which seeks either one or the other to the exclusion of either is not biblical, but in fact anti-biblical. This text stresses also that the covenantal faith must be kept with all thine heart and with all thy soul. Verse 16. The covenant law is not a way of salvation. Rather, it sets forth the way of life of the redeemed. To be in covenant with God means to be under His law. If we are not under His law, we are not under His covenant nor in His grace. The fact of God's covenant requires both grace and law. Antinomianism has insisted on the radical discontinuity between the Old and New Testaments. Charles Simeon, for example, wrote, "The Jewish covenant had respect in a great measure to temporal blessings, the bestowment of which was suspended entirely on their performance of certain conditions, whereas ours relates altogether to spiritual blessings, and, though it has conditions as well as theirs, it provides strength for the performance of them, and thereby secures from failure all those who cordially embrace it." It is hard to believe that champions of this view really believe it. Simeon said, and many echo him, that in the New Covenant ours are altogether spiritual blessings. Why do then these antinomians pray constantly for all kinds of material blessings? The covenant and its law require reciprocity. God tells Israel what He in His grace has done for them, and what they must do for Him, that is, obey His covenant law. This reciprocity is tied to gratitude. We are to remember God's mercies and be all the more faithful. We must, in humility, as a covenant people, see ourselves as simply the subjects of God's grace, not the possessors of a special merit. History is not a triumph of the self-willed, but of the God-ordained, and God can and does raise up His Assyrians in judgment on faithless peoples. The conditional character of the covenants and of God's blessings must be stressed. The modern perspective insists on a mindless cosmos in which man's mind and will are the only intelligent force. The determination of history then becomes a human decision. The universe or multiverse being mindless, there is no moral force or direction to history, only a brutal struggle for power. To deny God and His covenant is to strip life and history of purpose and meaning. As against this ugly and blind struggle for power, God's covenantal dealings with men tell us that history is a treaty, a contract made by God with men, an act of amazing grace. God's contract means that all of history has meaning, as does every life. As against meaningless chance, we have total meaning. Our Lord tells us, "The very hairs of your head are all numbered." Matthew chapter 10, verse 30. Such a total meaning is beyond our ability to comprehend, but it is essential to covenantalism because it insists on God's radical involvement in history. For antinomianism to surrender this for its pious emotions is a deadly loss. We began by calling attention to the fact that blessings are conditional upon obedience. Israel's sin was to believe that God's covenant is unconditional. This is the Church's sin also. God's grace gives us salvation and blessings. If we assume that this means an unconditional love from Him, we misconstrue His word. We cannot, as some hold, commit every sin in the book and still have God's unconditional love. We are plainly told in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17 that judgment must begin at the house of God. Again, in Matthew chapter 13, verse 12, we are told by our Lord, "For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath." This statement is repeated in Matthew chapter 25, verse 29, Mark chapter 4, verse 25, Luke chapter 8, verse 18, and Luke chapter 19, verse 26. Moreover, our Lord declares in Luke chapter 12, verse 48, "For unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required, and to whom men have committed much, of him they will ask the more." Israel had made a property and a possession out of God's grace and love, and now the church is doing the same. This is an invitation to judgment,